Everyone, it takes Zoom a couple of minutes to add everybody into the room, so we're going to wait a couple of minutes before we get started. Thanks so much for your patience. Good morning, everyone. It takes Zoom just a minute or so to add everybody into the room, so please sit tight and we'll get started in a moment. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Just going to give Zoom another 30 seconds or so to let people in and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, thank you everybody for waiting. We will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke Media briefing on the midterm elections. I'm Greg Phillips with Duke Communications. Next month's midterms take place with many Conservatives still claiming the 2020 election results were fraudulent despite the absence of any credible evidence. That, combined with inflation at its highest point in decades and a controversial abortion ruling by the US Supreme Court, has made for an unusual political environment for a midterm election. We have two Duke experts with us today to discuss the potential drivers of turnout in this election and the issues of election security and integrity that the last 2 years have brought to the forefront. With us today is Adrienne Fresh. She is an assistant professor of political science at Duke, whose areas of research include voting rights, election administration, and racial inequality. Also joining us is Sunshine Hillegas. She is a professor of political science and public policy who studies American political behavior, including young voters, campaigns and elections, and survey methods. Good morning to you both. Professor Hillegas, we'll start with you. Young voters make up the largest eligible voting bloc in the country, but historically they don't cast ballots in large numbers. Given the events of the last 2 years are certainly unprecedented in the lives of anyone under 35, is there any evidence that those events might actually make a difference in driving young people to the polls this year?
Well, I think, yes, there's some hope that young people will turn out. We have seen an increase in youth turnout in 2020 and also in 2018. Of course, it's useful to keep in mind that even though we have seen kind of historic levels of youth turnout, that the rates of turnout among young people remain pretty abysmal. So in 2018, one of the highest turnout rates in a midterm election by young people, still less than a third of young people actually voted. And so the gap in turnout between a midterm election and a presidential election is particularly large for young people. And so, there's no chance that we're going to see the type of turnout rates that we saw in a presidential election. And so I think there's real questions about, whether we'll match 2018, whether youth turnout will be high enough in states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, to be enough to kind of tip those races and make a difference. And one other thing that I would mention is that at the same time that young people have been motivated on issues of abortion, especially in recent months, but also climate change and gun control and other issues, we have seen record numbers of state laws passed with voting restrictions that disproportionately hurt young people. So we kind of have two different things working in different directions. In some states, those voter restrictions have been a mobilizing sort, an effort has been made to kind of overcome those voting restrictions, but much less so in other states.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Certainly lots to dig into there. But for now, Fresh, I would like to move to you. We've seen a lot of rhetoric over the last 2 years about the 2020 election being stolen, which we should note has not produced any evidence that has passed muster in court. Are you seeing any signs that rhetoric is emboldening candidates in next month's election to the point where they might be sufficiently emboldened to reject the results if they lose?
Yeah, so I think there are some worrying signs in this respect that suggest that candidates may not be willing to accept the outcome of elections, namely in the case of their defeat. So, of course, I don't have a crystal ball and prediction is always challenging, but I think first what you're seeing is an unprecedented number of candidates who are repeating this factually incorrect claim that the 2020 presidential election was fraudulent. According to some counts, this is well over 350 candidates and the majority of GOP candidates. In addition, you're further seeing GOP candidates who lost their primary election claim fraud. So as just one kind of example of this, Candace Taylor, GOP candidate for governor in Georgia, garnered less than 5% of the primary vote, but nevertheless claimed fraud and refused to concede defeat. Insofar as candidate primary behavior is indicative of a general election, which I think is difficult to extrapolate, as primary candidates tend to be more extreme, we might expect this kind of refusal to accept defeat. However, you're seeing candidates as well, like Arizona GOP gubernatorial candidate Lake, use the same language that then President Trump used in the run-up to the 2020 election. You know, I think it's sort of all over right now that to a point-blank question about whether she would be willing to concede defeat, were she to lose the election, she's stated that the only electoral outcome that she's willing to accept is victory. And this is just one example of many candidates who have made similar claims. So it's difficult as well to sort of draw the causal arrow between citizens and candidates, but we're also seeing polling that suggests that Republicans in particular, Republican voters in particular, I should say, are kind of undemocratically willing to only accept election results in the case that their preferred candidate wins. We're going to have to wait and see exactly what candidates do after the election. But I do think that this rhetoric is worrying and has implications for the stability of our democracy more broadly.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Fresh, and thank you both for those opening answers. We'll open it up to questions now. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. You can also pose questions in the Q&A window at any time. If you'd like to ask a question in person, please raise your hand in Zoom and we will unmute you when your turn comes around. If you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Professor Elligas, I'd like to come back to you. And you mentioned in your opening comments that one of the things that could affect turnout this year are some of the voting restrictions laws that have been passed at the state level across the country. Are there any that you've noticed that are particularly significant this year?
Well, I think there's two states that actually there's some nice overlap with what Professor Fresh is talking about, because there have been both laws passed with respect to voting restrictions. They are close states. They are states in which young people have seen increases in voter registration, but also increased voter restrictions, but also interference laws. So that are going to potentially enable some efforts to try and challenge results. And this is Arizona and Georgia in particular. These are states where there is a potential for young people to be decisive, but young people are also disproportionately affected by laws that have made it more difficult. So you've probably surely seen some of the stories, and in Georgia, it's everything from the ability to challenge registrations, where what they were finding is that young people of color and college students were leaving off a dorm room number or an apartment number, and so there were some challenges. And while those weren't approved, those challenges are things that I think we will continue to see. The restrictions on providing water and food in long lines are ones that are impacting even the type of mobilization efforts that we had seen in previous elections. and restrictions on Sunday voter registration and vote and early voting, which disproportionately impact people of color, because there have been, from church to voting efforts that are being threatened. At the same time, right, it is the case that these type of voting restrictions have been a bit of a mobilizing force in the state of Georgia to some extent. And so it's really difficult to kind of look at and sort out and make a prediction. And unfortunately, right now, a lot of what we are trying to look at polling numbers to try and figure out, where are things headed. But young people are really difficult to get into polls, and polls and midterms are very, very difficult to get right. And I'm happy to kind of go into why that's the case and why we have to be very cautious in trying to interpret, polling numbers. And so all of this is to say that it matters a lot what the media talk about with respect to the elections. And unfortunately, we can't necessarily make strong predictions just because we don't have, accurate and compelling data in a midterm election, because turnout is so variable and so much lower than a presidential election.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And I definitely want to come back to the topic of polling. But before we move on from the state level restrictions, could you just kind of sum up the state of play in North Carolina? I gather there haven't been any major changes, but anything that people should know, especially if they're heading to the polls early?
Yeah, there are no changes in North Carolina. There were efforts by the legislature to make some restrictions, but there have been none made. So at this point, we have passed the voter registration date, but you can go and do so at early voting. And so early voting starts tomorrow. Early and what we are seeing in terms of voter registration numbers, North Carolina is one of the handful of states where there has been an increase in voter registration numbers compared to this point in 2018. Which gives some suggestion that we might be on track for the type of turnout rates that we saw in 2018. Again, though, when it comes to young people in North Carolina, voter registration has actually been highest among unaffiliated voters and among Republicans as opposed to Democrats. And so in terms of predicting what that impact is going to be is quite a bit more difficult.
Absolutely. Thank you. Professor Fresh, I'd like to come back to you and the opening question. You talked about there are a large number of candidates here that are running that also denied the result of the 2020 election. And so I'm curious, given that, with such a large number of candidates, some of them will be elected, what does it mean for election security and the future of the democratic institutions in this country if you have people in power who don't believe that they are functioning properly?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think, let me walk it back even before we get to politicians being elected, so that we can think as well about the consequences of the rhetoric in and of itself. So I think the proliferation of this kind of rhetoric about a stolen 2020 election is worrying for the future of our democratic institutions. And I think it's always important to say that democracy is not simply a set of institutions like free and fair elections, but it also is a set of widely shared values amongst the populace that these are the proper governing institutions, as well as the shared belief that those proper institutions are functioning according to their intended rules. So in short, research shows that democracy is fragile, absent citizen belief in its legitimacy. And the rhetoric of a stolen 2020 election suggests that many elites are lacking in these requisite beliefs in democratic institutions, although we note that they're still willing to participate insofar as they're running for office. Of course, it's important to acknowledge that this rhetoric may be a ploy or a tactic, but that's not likely to be the case universally. Beyond this, polling is suggesting that a worrying share of citizens share these elite beliefs as well. Around 40% of Republicans polled in recent surveys believe that the 2020 election was fraudulent. So given these beliefs, why concretely do they matter? I think that there are three things that I want to highlight. The first is in terms of democratic participation. The second is in terms of, as you asked about, elected politicians pursuing actions and policies that undermine democracy. And I think the third is the potential unwillingness of citizens to sanction politicians for those actions that undermine democracy. So taking these each in turn. First, if we're concerned about electoral participation or other forms of democratic participation, if citizens withdraw from the democratic process, if they don't vote, this potentially impacts the extent to which politicians are representing the public. Public may not perceive rules and regulations that they're subject to be legitimate, and they may withdraw their compliance. One piece of evidence that I'll point to that kind of gives us some confidence in this domain is that research from the 2021 special election in Georgia does suggest that those voters who were more likely to like or retweet misinformation online claiming that the 2020 election was fraudulent were not meaningfully less likely to turn out to vote. So it doesn't seem like there's this kind of penalty in participation. Of course, there are challenges to generalizing these findings, and I think a lot of scholars are waiting to see how this election turns out in order to analyze this relationship between belief in fraud and participation. Second, while we might think that citizen participation in democracy is kind of this normative good, something that we want to encourage writ large, of course, it's the case that this participation by people who believe this fraudulent claim or this claim that the 2020 election was fraudulent may result in the election of politicians who also believe that the election was stolen incorrectly. So, despite being elected via democratic means, these politicians may not believe in the legitimacy of the institutions they inhabit. They may even have other ends that they wish to achieve that contradict democracy. And so they too may fail to comply with the rules that govern how they should behave within these institutions. And research shows that in a plurality of democratic erosion contexts beyond the US, it's what we might call gradual executive takeovers, these slow subversions of democratic institutions by democratically elected leaders that are the plurality of instances in which democracy is really eroded. And I guess third and finally, the point that I want to bring up is, citizens who don't believe in the legitimacy of democratic institutions or who don't care about them enough relative to other concerns may be less likely to do anything, that is to sanction politicians in some way, should they take action to erode democracy. So again, going back to the research, there's this important argument that the politicians who are successful in other non-US contexts in terms of democratic erosion are those who pair a popular policy platform with actions that are contrary to democracy. So voters are essentially facing this trade-off between voting for a candidate whose policies they prefer, but who might subvert democracy or who has in the past, as opposed to a candidate who's willing to uphold democracy, but whose policies in other issue areas may be less appealing. And so when the electorate is polarized in this way, the loss in policy is sort of, too great to be overcome by choosing the candidate who supports democracy. And I guess I would point to kind of this notion of insidious polarization as being really important to help us understand why exactly this rhetoric might actually have consequences for our institutions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Fresh, for that comprehensive overview. And there's more about that I want to ask you about. But Professor Hillegas, I'd like to come back to you. You mentioned in your last answer about the difficulties in conducting and interpreting polls, especially around a midterm. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what we should or shouldn't be paying attention to as it pertains to polling?
Sure. I think there's a tendency to want a headline that is, snappy and focuses on the horse race. But the reality of pre-election polling is number one is that in state level polls, which are the ones that are kind of the basis for 538 and other election predictions, that the vast majority of those are ones that are using lower methodological standards than what you see in presidential elections when it's larger polling organizations who are conducting. And so the sampling methodology itself is less reliable. Second, there are fewer of those polls, and many of them are being conducted by entrepreneurial pollsters who are not necessarily being paid by an organization or by an organization that has a partisan interest. And so it makes it very difficult to draw inferences given the variety of different errors that we see in state level polls, and not to mention, it gets even worse when you get down to House race type of polls. But the biggest issue, even if you have kind of the best pollster out there doing the polling, which we don't, that at the end of the day, the strength of a poll, the reason it's scientific is that if you randomly draw a sample from a population, you can make inferences from that sample to the population, but we don't know the population. And that is, we don't know who is going to vote in a midterm election when election rates are, quite a bit lower, when you have a lot of people who are registered to vote who don't turn out. Trying to predict who is going to vote and who is not is very difficult. And so at the end of the day, the kind of tool of polling is not particularly useful in a midterm election, especially. So we just have to be really cautious, and particularly given that some of the groups that we are most interested in seeing their movement, so whether young people or people of color or independents or the unaffiliated, these are all groups that are particularly difficult to get into polls and are particularly variable in their turnout from one election to the next. And so whether you're talking about, the polling in Georgia, the polling in North Carolina, I would just urge real caution in over-interpreting those polling numbers, which is not to say we can't draw some information from trends. We can, but I wouldn't, stake my life on, that the current point, estimate of what the candidates have is one that's going to reflect what we see on election day.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor Hillegas. Professor Fresh, I'd like to come back to you. Something we've seen a lot in the news is election offices across the state and the country being overwhelmed with Freedom of Information Act requests, often in the form of form letters from citizens questioning the results of the 2020 election that are long since certified. Can you talk a little bit about the concern that some election directors have expressed that this might pull their resources away from managing the upcoming election? Do you have any concern that this could interfere with the safe and secure management of the midterm election?
Yeah, so I think it's important to both heed the concerns of election administrators who are raising this issue of Freedom of Information Act requests, and also not to take this issue too far in questioning the integrity of the upcoming election. So the reason that I'm not particularly concerned about the upcoming election is primarily because the job responsibilities of election administrators are first and foremost to administer elections according to the rules, freely and fairly. And secondarily, because Freedom of Information Act laws allow some discretion in terms of the timing with which election administrators can respond to these requests. So they oftentimes use language like prompt reply without specifying precisely how long administrators must take in order to respond. And so this allows them the ability to focus on the current election at hand while still being in compliance with the law, that is, fulfilling these requests. At the same time, in heeding election administrators' concerns, I think we should be looking to the long-term implications that potentially necessitate some sort of remedy. So I think that absent a commensurate increase in resources, that is, staff or monetary resources with which election administrators can deal with these requests, it is possible that they interfere with administrators' primary duty, which is administering elections freely and fairly. And one of the reasons that I'm concerned is because, as we talked about before, this increase in rhetoric about fraudulent elections, the increase in politicians who are sort of unwilling to say that they would concede defeat were they to lose an election, suggests, although we'll have to see how this is borne out, an increase in individuals, whether on their own or through organized efforts, inundating election administrators with requests for additional information. So the breadth and volume of these requests may increase. And it may reach a tipping point where they really are interfering with administrators' duties. However, I might say that what's perhaps more worrying to me is that these burdens may overwhelm administrators in such a way where it interferes with our as a democratic polity, but government's abilities to attract and retain qualified individuals for the job. So we've already seen some cases like Gillespie County in Texas, where election administrators resigned in part due to this inundation with FOIA requests. Research is really clear that qualified bureaucrats are retained when they have high feelings of efficacy in their jobs. So when they feel like they are doing the work that they consider meaningful and that's within, the primary responsibilities of their job. Fulfilling FOIA requests that they may believe to be deliberately designed to overwhelm them, that is, to interfere with their jobs, may undermine these feelings of efficacy. Similarly, dealing with FOIA requests that are viewed as questioning whether these administrators have adequately fulfilled their jobs, questioning the institution's integrity, but also perhaps being viewed on a more personal level as questioning their own competence and integrity, may again undermine these feelings of efficacy, and those are essential for retention. So I think the one thing that this then points to is the potential for individuals who are unwilling, uninterested in upholding democratic principles to use vacancies within local administration, local electoral administration, to seek out those jobs and to not dispense with the duties of those jobs in a free and fair way. And I do think that that is something to be concerned about and something that policymakers may wish to look to remedy.
Sure, thank you very much. Professor Hillegas, wanted to come back to you. You've talked about the dangers of interpreting polls. Early voting is open in several states. We'll open here in North Carolina tomorrow. What, if anything, can we interpret from early voting numbers, or should we be wary of extrapolating too much from those too?
Yeah, I think we learned that lesson in the previous election, that the patterns of early voting, while they might have been in the past a little bit more, even across, the bipartisanship, that at the end of the day that there are differences, or there were differences in 2020 in who is showing up and doing early voting, and so they are not necessarily going to be representative of how things will look on election day. And so Certainly there will be attempts to interpret. I mean, this is the thing is that, you know, we all want that crystal ball. We all want to use information, and like polling, early voting results provide some information, but we just don't have sufficient understanding. We just don't have sufficient information to know if those are going to be predictive of the election results.
Sure, absolutely. That makes sense. Thank you. Professor Fresh, I'd like to come back to you. We have seen that there's a contentious North Carolina Supreme Court race happening this year. Could you talk a little bit about that and why it could be important to voting restrictions and election access in this state?
Sure. So there are actually 2 seats that are up. So since 2016, the North Carolina Supreme Court has been a partisan court. And at the moment, the current court composition favors Democrats 4-3. But there's one incumbent and one open race that have the potential to change that partisan composition of the court. I think one of the places where this concerns me is in the court's adjudication of challenges to election results that may end up before them. So as we've been talking about, there is this increase in rhetoric, questioning a past election, and indications that candidates may be unwilling to accept defeat and may use recourses like the court system in order to challenge the results of elections. And should those challenges work their way through the court, find themselves in front of the Supreme Court, then there is a potential for a partisan court to be making a decision with respect to a partisan election. And when we talk about legitimacy, we talked about legitimacy of institutions like elections or representative institutions. It's also important to remember that legitimacy extends to the court as well. In fact, oftentimes we think of the courts as being the democratic institution that depends on legitimacy even more so than other institutions. And one of the reasons is because courts don't have enforcement mechanisms of their own, and they rely on other branches of the government and the potential for citizens to pressure or sanction other branches of government when court rulings aren't complied with. But that legitimacy is oftentimes founded on, you always go back to John Roberts, Chief Justice, in his confirmation hearings discussing balls and strikes. It's oftentimes predicated on this notion that the court is this, neutral arbiter of disputes. And were you to see a situation in which a Democratic majority North Carolina Supreme Court is deciding these contested elections in favor of Democrats, or alternatively, a Republican majority court deciding these cases in favor of Republicans, this may undermine the citizens' belief that this court is anything other than another kind of branch of other partisan institutions. And that may have implications for sort of the other branches of government following through with decisions that the court undertakes, and the role of the citizenry in pressuring those institutions to do that. So I think that's one of my main concerns with respect to the composition of the court.
Sure, thank you very much. Professor Hillegas, I'd like to come back to you for a question we had come through the Q&A, which says the day after the 2020 election, we heard Trump and voters who supported him chanting, "Stop the count," as votes were still being counted. Does the public's lack of understanding of how the counting process works, does that surprise you? And is that something that we need to look at? Is that something we need to fix? Or is it just kind of one of those echo chamber type things that we're stuck with, do you think?
I mean, first, I would say that it is not at all a surprise. I also am not sure that it should be an expectation that the public understands all of the nitty-gritty details of election administration. And in fact, if anything, and one of the reasons that we have such low turnout is because of the complexity of the election laws and the variation in election laws across different states. So it is the layer of rules, the variation, the rules, the complexity of the rules that is really, when you compare to other countries, kind of crazy. I mean, even just the number of races that we expect our citizens to vote in is like, really, can people spend time finding out about, the dog catcher race and all of these different races down the ballot, that the expectations of the public to spend time beyond just working their jobs and raising their children and so on about to be good citizens. I absolutely don't think that it's a surprise, but I also don't think that it is something that we should expect. So that said, that doesn't mean that misperceptions about the process are not important. And here, as the question asks, this echo chamber becomes important. It becomes important to consider, are there political elites who are responsible for understanding the rules and reflecting those appropriately? Is it a concern that they are really pushing misinformation? And there, that's very important, and it is something that we have to take seriously and think about how to address. So again, I think that we have to be careful that we don't create unrealistic expectations about what the public should know. And one of the things that I've seen in studying young voters in particular is that, in part, the complexity of election laws in the US and elections is one of the things that can undermine their confidence that they can, in fact, that they're eligible and informed enough to participate in the election. And at the end of the day, the thing that I most want to see are more people participating and rules that don't get in the way of people participating.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Also, we had a follow-up question to come back to some of your comments about young voters earlier. As you mentioned, obviously turnout is always much lower in the midterms, and that's true of young voters too. If you take presidential elections, out of the picture and you look at midterms, has there been a gradual increase in young voter participation in midterms? And if so, would you expect that to increase on the same curve this time, or maybe there to be more of a jump because there have been there's just been such a busy political 2 years and a lot of kind of unprecedented things happening in the lives of young voters that they won't have seen before?
I mean, honestly, I would be pleasantly surprised if we match the 2018 numbers. So one of the things that we have to see, so there is no doubt, right, that the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade was a mobilizing force, particularly among young women. We saw, where there had been kind of parity between registration rates between young men and young women. Young women were more likely in the months since in a lot of states to be registering to vote. So that points to this potential level of turnout that would at least be on track with 2018, if not potentially exceeding. But there are many states where the turnout has not matched what we saw in 2018. Keep in mind too that young people have been very much impacted by the pandemic, and there is really this kind of mental health crisis that's going on. I think among young people, where we're expecting that they're going to have the bandwidth to navigate the rules of participating voting relative to 2018. I think it makes me question whether or not we will match those numbers. And then the final thing is that in 2018, the question is if young voters are going to be predominantly, and actually all voters, predominantly motivated by the issues of concern and in support of some of the policies that Democrats are proposing, or if there's going to really just be this reaction to, do people, so we often see that, the opponents of the person in power are more likely to be motivated to participate. And so again, like what the balance and consequences of youth turnout and increased youth turnout might look like are unclear. So, in some states where it's unaffiliated and Republicans who are seeing the bounce, it might be a reaction to the Biden policies, as opposed to young people who are more liberal coming out in support. So I think that there's too many factors to make a clear prediction. There's certainly not all the factors lining up to say, that we are set up to see kind of, increase, record breaking once again. I think that there could be some states where that's the case, but I don't think that nationally we're going to necessarily, do better than 2018.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Professor Fresh, coming back to you, I'd like to zoom back out a little bit. You talked a little bit earlier about the strength of our democratic institutions, and there are some people expressing concern that the insurrection and the actions after the 2020 election reflect some sort of slide towards authoritarianism, or at least away from democracy. What can you say about what your research and what you've seen, whether there is actually evidence for that? The reaction of people to these election results and the refusal to accept them actually seems like a wholesale rejection of democratic principles.
Yeah, so I think that this is a really important question because it's important to separate rhetoric from action. And I mean action both in terms of the actions of individuals, but also as well the kind of actions of our institutions, that is the functioning of our institutions. And when you separate rhetoric and action, I think it's easier to tease apart what is mere lip service to democracy and what we might construe as genuine concern for the functioning of our institutions. In short, democracy is kind of just a term when it's used rhetorically, and that term can be strategically deployed. And one can argue that the use of the term at the moment is very much part of this competition over the moral high ground with respect to our institutions. I want to note that the term democracy can be understood by different people in different ways. And indeed, amongst political scientists, there's not a kind of single agreed upon measure of democracy, although there is, of course, broad agreement on key components of it. So, for example, survey responses by Americans have long indicated significant support for democracy, but these survey questions oftentimes, most typically, ask just about the term democracy with little additional specificity, which really leaves respondents to understand and interpret the term in their own way. And there's evidence to suggest that when Americans profess support for democracy, it's oftentimes because of a social norm. Their belief that others think that they should prefer democracy, as opposed to necessarily a deep understanding of constituent components of democracy and support for all of those components. But when you basically consider one core component, this idea of free and fair elections, the idea that democracy needs to supply regular opportunities for changing governing officials, and the idea that changing governing officials means that incumbents, or indeed who you support, may not win the election. You pair this with polling data showing that more than a third of Republicans and about half as many Democrats are only willing to accept election results that return their preferred candidate. I think you begin to see this disconnect between rhetorical support for democracy and behavioral support, insofar as these survey questions are speaking to at least an expected behavior. Moreover, I think in terms of the functioning of our electoral institutions, it's worth saying again and again, there's no evidence of meaningful fraud that has changed any election outcomes in 2020 or any of these subsequent races. It's just hard to be any more clear about that. And because of this, those who are, professing concern for election integrity, but who are taking actions that actually undermine its integrity. For example, as we talked about before, inundating election administrators with these Freedom of Information Act requests. And who are also supporting candidates who indicate their support for non-democratic policies. As revealed by their actions, if not an authoritarian tendency, which might be too extreme, at the very least, it's a concerning apathy for democracy. And so I think overall, when you consider the clear evidence indicating that our electoral institutions function freely and fairly, it becomes more clear that many people are using this rhetoric of democratic integrity for partisan or otherwise undemocratic purposes. And so I think separating rhetoric from action allows us to see that these two things don't necessarily go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We're going to be wrapping up here soon. Just going to get a few more questions in before we go. Professor Hilligas, we've had a number of questions about a case coming before the US Supreme Court, which, if they rule a certain way, would give state legislatures absolute power on how to decide to certify and rule over elections in their state. Do you have any concern that this could add to the issues we're having regarding election security and the free and fair conduct of elections?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that as Professor Fresh mentioned, that the legitimacy of the Supreme of a court, whether in a state court or the U.S. Supreme Court, is something that is tenuous. And the U.S. Supreme Court, we have seen in terms of public opinion, just dramatic drops in particularly among Democrats in the perceived legitimacy of the U.S. Supreme Court, and views that this current Supreme Court is really driven by ideological concerns. So on the one hand, there are some recent I think that there is some recent indications that that the Supreme Court is concerned about these perceptions. And so, this case in particular is one that I think would have implications for, both not only how elections are being run, but then the perceptions of those elections and the perceptions of the Supreme Court. And so I think that Chief Justice Roberts in particular has shown in the past, in the rulings on the census, for instance, some concern about the Supreme Court's views by the public, and so that very well could be something that is relevant for their decision making here. But then again, right, a lot of the cases that have come before the Supreme Court dealing with redistricting issues have essentially just kicked everything back to the legislative bodies. And so, I think this is one case that could be exceptionally important, and it's one that's not going to get as much attention in the press as the overturning of Roe v. Wade, but could have some pretty big consequences for the conduct of elections moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. We're going to wrap it up here shortly, but I do have one final question for each of you. And Professor Fresh, we'll start with you. Of course, you know, every election is the most important election when it's coming up, but certainly it has been a wild couple of years. Can you say, like, as you go in and you're watching this and you're living through this, what to you is, are there any particularly important aspects or things that make this election more important than ever that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I think that I definitely come at this election from the perspective of the healthy functioning of our democratic institutions. And from that perspective, I think that the election is really important in terms of how voters weigh the rhetoric that candidates are spreading about the integrity of our electoral institutions, their willingness to concede defeat should they lose the vote. And obviously, it's the case that this is not the only issue that voters are considering when they choose their candidate at the polls. But I'm interested to see how they make this trade-off between what you might consider a policy platform on other dimensions that speaks to them with this concern for democratic institutions. And so from a scholarship perspective, I really look forward to understanding that in the wake of the election much better.
Absolutely, thank you. And Professor Hilliger, same question to you. What do you think makes this election so important?
So I do think that this question of how people respond to the election outcomes is going to be critical. And in many respects, this is an election in which it could be a normal election, right? You know, where people are responding to how things are going in the country, and in that respect, right? Like, you know, that things don't look great for the Democrats, but they shouldn't look great for the Democrats in terms of the state of the economy. And yet, right, and people have kind of gone back to their lives after, you know, having the chaos of 2020. And I think the reason that it is so important is to see if that's how it's interpreted when the election results come out, is if it is interpreted as, you know, this is much like previous elections in which, you know, the things that drove people to vote and the outcomes that we see are ones that are quite standard. And if not, then it really, I think, raises a question of how, you know, who's going to jump in with the presidential race, who's going to show up for the presidential race, and there, you know, we kind of have two different tracks. Like, are we kind of on a track back, or are we on a track to continuing to have real concerns about the functioning of democracy? And so in that respect, I think, you know, 2022 just becomes so important to figure out, like, where are we headed for 2024?
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we will call it there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, Adrian Fresh and Sunshine Hilligas, for sharing your expertise and opinions. If you'd like to be notified about upcoming briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu, or if you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. We will be back next week to talk about climate and the election, and we will be holding a briefing the day after the election on November 9th to discuss what happened. In the meantime, early voting opens tomorrow in North Carolina and is already open in many other states, so